The new world of words, of dictionaries in the 17th and 18th centuries, now takes us to the New World itself. And in this third part of this lecture series, I'm going to be focusing on the language of America and, more broadly, the ways in which English went from the British Isles to the colonies and to the world. One of the central questions that I'll be asking is what the relationship is between language and national identity, and how the legacies of colonial expansion and British education inform the idioms and the ideologies of America, but also, in my later lectures, India, Australia, South Africa, Canada, indeed anywhere that English is spoken. When we look at the English language in America, we need to think about vocabulary, grammar, pronunciation, and style. And so what I will be doing in this set of lectures will be looking closely at the ways in which American English is made up not simply of new words, but of phrases and pronunciations. I also want to make clear that the differences between British and American English were noticed relatively early in the life of the American nation. And I also want to return to the issue of dialects, dialectology as a discipline, and also the literary representation of dialects to raise anew questions about the relationship between regionalism and standard, now in American 19th and 20th century literatures. So to begin, where does American English begin? American English in many ways begins where America begins. Early settlements were points not only of economic entry, not only of entry of population, but they were entry of language. And many of, if you like, the nodal points or seed points of American dialects and regional forms come from those original settlement points. And so in New England, you have Boston, Massachusetts, and the Bay Colony in the early 17th century. If you move south, you see a new settlement point in New London on the Thames River in Connecticut in the early 18th century. Moving through the Middle Atlantic, New York, which was founded as New Amsterdam and seized by the English from the Dutch in 1644. You have Pennsylvania, founded by William Penn in 1681. And moving down the coast, you have the South Atlantic settlements in Virginia, the Jamestown colony of 1607, Charleston, South Carolina in the late 17th century, Georgia in the 1730s. These areas of settlement are points of dialect origin. Each place was settled by speakers of distinctive English dialects, and the sounds and the forms of the language descended from these earlier English regions. Indeed, many of these settlements are at the mouths of rivers, and rivers become points of linguistic change. As we saw in my discussions of Anglo-Saxon England, Middle English, and early modern English, the dialect boundaries are very often natural boundaries, and rivers constitute, as much for early America as for the British Isles, dialect boundaries as well. The West is settled beginning in the 19th century with the Louisiana Purchase of 1803, and this brings contact with French-speaking groups in New Orleans and throughout the Northwest. Non-European language groups helped form a regional dialect, and the contact between English speakers and speakers of Native American languages also informs the way in which new words enter the language. With the California Gold Rush of 1849, you see a pioneering group that comes mainly from the Northeast. And what you see is a kind of dialect boundary moving across the country. It seems to me that one of the reasons why the particular forms of the speech of California in particular are so close to those of the Northeast is that the travel bypassed land for sea, and that many of the original settlers did not go across the continent, but rather came by way of ship. And so what we're looking at is a pattern of settlement, a pattern of migration and movement, and a pattern of contact with English, and in the earliest phases, German and Dutch, French in the Southwest and in the West, Spanish, and also with the Native American languages. Early American English pronounced sounds that were different from British English, and I want to go through in some detail, if you like, the phonology of American English. One of the key features of the sound of American English, if you like, the sound pattern, is the short A, which we could describe in greater detail as phoneticians as the ash sound. This is a mid-front vowel, and it is the vowel characteristically in the American pronunciations of the words cat and hat. Now, in British English, these tended to be pronounced with an ah sound rather than an eh sound. And so you had cat and hat, as opposed to cat and hat. In American English, the ah sound stayed in a word like father, but in certain dialects of British English, that ah sound was, as we would say, retracted and lowered. That is, it moved back in the mouth and it moved down in the throat. And so the ah sound of father became aw, as in father. This is, as some scholars have suggested, in fact, not a true linguistic change, but rather a way of speaking that is attributed to the stage pronunciation of the great 18th century actor David Garrick. And so there is some question as to how much the ah in father is affectation and how much of it is part of a natural set of changes in pronunciation. So one of the key differences between British and American English is the development of the ah sound. Now, R is an interesting problem, and the R sound becomes variable in certain environments. You'll remember from a previous lecture the way in which I talked about how the R sound very often affected the preceding vowel. And that is that in the course of the history of the English language, ER or IR sounds sometimes are R sounds. And you see this in varying pronunciations in England and America. So that, for example, you have the British pronunciation Clark and the American pronunciation clerk. You have the British philosopher Berkeley and the American university Berkeley. You have the idea of a university, but you have the varsity team. And you have vermin, but you have varmint. And these are words that give evidence of the instability of the vowel preceding an R. Now, in early American English, there is the R pronounced very often at the end of the words. And so one of the characteristic features of American English is the retention of the R in words like father rather than father. And also in the middle, for example, in the word Lord, that Americans tend to pronounce with an R, speakers of British English tend to pronounce rather Lord without the articulated R sound. Another vowel worth noticing is the short O, and this remains a rounded vowel in British English, but we could say it's unrounded to an ah sound. Now, what does this mean? It means that when you pronounce this vowel, your lips are in the rounded position. And so in British English, you have the pronunciation of such words as not, hop, and hot. I'm exaggerating a little, but I want to make clear the way in which these are rounded sounds. In American English, these tend to be unrounded. That is, that the vowel was pronounced with the lips relatively flat rather than round. And so this created the sound more like an ah than an o. So in America, people tend to pronounce not as not, and hop as hop, and hot as hot. There are also changes in word stress. American English preserves full stresses and pronunciations of polysyllabic words, whereas British English tends not to. And this was something that was noticed as early as the early 19th century, that in British English you hear pronunciations such as secretary rather than secretary, and necessary rather than necessary. Occasionally in British English you'll hear the pronunciation literature rather than literature. And so, really, from very early in its history, American English privileged or preferred the full weight of syllables in words. What are the differences in grammar and morphology? That is, the ways in which the American form of English had different grammatical categories and the way in which British English changed. It has been long argued that American English preserves some old forms in regional dialects, in particular strong verbs. There's a very famous story of the sportsman, the baseball player who became a sportscaster, Dizzy Dean, who, in a moment of excitement, calls a game about an individual who slides into third, and he said he slud into third. This is not a regional pronunciation or an illiterate form. This is an old, strong verb that is still preserved in regional pockets of American English. Other strong verbs, that is, you'll remember from my previous lectures, verbs that signal change in tense by altering meaningfully the root vowel. You'll hear help and hulp, and sometimes you'll hear climb and clum. American regional dialects, it has been argued, recreate a second-person plural form. And so you'll remember also the way in which the thou forms were singular and informal, and the you forms were formal and plural. And we saw how you becomes, in effect, the unmarked form in standard spoken and written English, and thou and thee become restricted to particular kinds of social situations, Quaker speak, the language of the King James Bible, and so on. So some regional dialects, particularly in the South, it has been argued, recreate the distinction between a singular and a plural. So there's a difference between you and y'all, and a difference between your and yous in some way. Another important grammatical distinction is that in American English, collective nouns take the singular, whereas in British they take the plural. This is most noticed today, for example, when you read the financial page. For example, the Ford Motor Company is doing something in America, but in Britain, the Ford Motor Company are doing something. So the collective noun takes the plural in British English, but the singular in America. Now, I think most people notice differences in American and British English in matters of vocabulary. And to this day, one can argue that the major distinctions are vocabulary distinctions. When we look today at things like the difference between a truck and a lorry, the difference between the trunk and the boot, the difference between the elevator and the lift, and so on, we can make lists of these technical distinctions. But many of these distinctions emerged very early in the history of American English, even before there were trucks and lorries and boots and motors and elevators. And so some of these changes in vocabulary grew out of different words for the same thing or words for different purposes. And some examples, it seems to me, of this problem are in interesting uses of verbs. So, for example, American English preserves the older use of such words as reckon and guess. And phrases such as I reckon and I guess are obvious Americanisms, but they're really remnants of much older forms of English lost by British speakers. It is true that in certain dialect areas of Britain and in certain class areas of Britain, the verb reckon does effectively mean what Americans mean by I guess, meaning I assume or it seems to me. But the idea of reckon as a regionalism in America, and the idea of I guess as the sort of unmarked or standard form of, well, it just seems to me, these are perceived and were perceived long ago as features of American. Now, attitudes towards American English were mixed, and they begin almost as soon as individuals are coming back from America. The writer Alexander Gill, about whom I've spoken in great detail, Milton's teacher in the Logonomia Anglica of 1619 and in its revised version of 1621, commented on the importation of words coming from America. And as early as 1621, he can condemn the use of a word like maize, which means corn, and canoe coming into the language. Travelers to the colonies and to the early republic often recorded their responses to American English. Mrs. Trollope visited the United States in the 1830s, and she commented in many ways on, as she said, quote, "how very debased the language has become in such a short period in America." She and many other travelers noticed how Americans were using different expressions. For example, Americans use the phrase right away to mean it's coming up. I'm going to do something right away. This was perceived as early as the 1830s as an Americanism. Americans liked the verb admire. I admire something. And it became characteristic of American speech. And one of the earliest things noticed about American speech was the use of the verb to fix, meaning to prepare, like I'm going to fix dinner. This is perceived very, very early as an Americanism. Now, when we look at these Americanisms, and when we look at the perception of American English as debased, we need to qualify this set of assumptions. And what I'd like to turn to now are the writings of two major figures in early America who help us understand the nature of Americanism and help us understand the relationship between British English and the emerging language of the Americas. And I want to begin with the figure of John Witherspoon, who was born in about 1722 or 23 in Scotland. He came to America in 1769, and he wrote prolifically about the American language. He was a figure of ecclesiastical and institutional control, and he was one of the early presidents of Princeton University. He was a key figure in American politics and education, and he argued that American education needed to tighten up on the teaching of grammar and style. Witherspoon, writing in 1781, noted that every day, quote, he heard errors in grammar, improprieties, and vulgarisms, which hardly any person of the same class, in point of rank and literature, would have fallen into in Great Britain. So what he means here is, you have to remember the word propriety. What he means is that he is noticing among the literate and educated classes differences in grammar and usage from those of the British Isles. And he calls those improprieties. What he calls vulgarisms are not necessarily crass or obscene terms, but rather terms from the lower classes that have percolated up into the vocabulary and the idiom of the educated or the landholding classes. And so Witherspoon's point is that when you draw the line at class, the Americans seem to speak differently than their class counterparts in Britain. But, he goes on, quote, the vulgar in America speak much better than the vulgar in Great Britain, for a very obvious reason, that being much more unsettled and moving frequently from place to place, they are not so liable to local peculiarities, either in accent or phraseology. So, by contrast, what Witherspoon notices is this, that the quote-unquote vulgar, the common people, the working people, the people who are not necessarily educated or literate, that these people seem to speak more correctly, they speak better than their corresponding class group in Great Britain, and he attributes this to the geographical mobility of the American people. In other words, there is a contrast between the geographical mobility of the American people and the traditional regional fixing of the great British people into the regional dialects and class hierarchies of the time. Now, Witherspoon also is fascinated by the idea of an American language, and he's fascinated by the idea of Americanism. And one of the things that Witherspoon does is he coins the term Americanism. And it's a fascinating example of how he does so. Writing in 1781, he offers the following reflection, and this is a somewhat long passage that I'd like to read. I understand a use of phrases or terms or a construction of sentences, even among people of rank and education, different from the use of the same terms or phrases or the construction of similar sentences in Great Britain. It does not follow from a man's using these that he is ignorant or his discourse upon the whole inelegant. Nay, it does not follow in every case that the terms or phrases used are worse in themselves, but merely that they are of American and not English growth. The word Americanism, which I have coined for the purpose, is exactly similar in its formation and significance to the word Scotticism. Now, look at his phrasing here. In particular, look at his phrasing, English growth. He's really talking about not simply the growth or development of a language. He's talking about the word growth in the way that a vintner uses growth, that is, a particular vine, the way in which landscape artists would use the term to describe the way that something was painted. The idea of growth here is an aesthetic term. It's a term of painting, it's a term of winemaking, it's a term of high culture. Language is something that is a commodity, but language is also something that is alive. To coin a phrase, even though this is a relatively old phrase, the idea of coinage now suggests that words are commodities. And in a sense, the American language for Witherspoon is as distinctive as American vegetation or the American landscape. And so what he's clarifying here is the way in which Americanisms like Scotticisms, and remember Witherspoon is a Scot, the way in which Americanisms are now constituting a separate form, a body of locutions, a discourse for a new country. So Witherspoon is important because he's recognizing differences and distinctions, and he is a person of, if you like, intellectual and educational arbitration, so that what he has to say carries great weight in the early American period. The other figure that I'd like to focus on in this early American period is Noah Webster, who lived from 1758 to 1843. He was born in Hartford, Connecticut. He has a BA from Yale University, and Webster is best known today, of course, as the eponymous creator of the dictionary. Just as Johnson in his own time and afterwards was called Dictionary Johnson, so Webster was Dictionary Webster, to the point where the very name Webster comes to stand almost like Kleenex or Frigidaire or Victrola for the object itself. Go look it up in Webster's, whether or not the particular dictionary we have descends from Noah Webster's work. Now, before Webster published his famous American Dictionary in 1828, he was writing frequently on the nature of American usage and the ideals of American language. And his attitudes were similar to those of Joseph Priestley on the relationships between language and freedom, if you like, and the way in which a new language was necessary for a new country. And so when we look at Webster, what we're looking at is someone who is a descriptivist in many ways, but someone who is also very cognizant, very aware of the relationship between language and politics. Now, remember Priestley's line about the genius of a free nation. Recall that now when Webster announced in his Dissertations on the English Language, which appeared in 1791. And here he's writing, quote, "As an independent nation, our honor requires us to have a system of our own in language as well as government." And he continues, and I quote, "A national language is a band of national union." And so central to Webster's point is that the new nation needs a new language. And as I will discuss in my following lecture, Webster makes clear that certain words for political or social institutions in Britain, words like Congress or Senate, mean something radically different in America. And what Webster also recognizes is that the language is a band of national union. In other words, that part of what defines a political entity is a shared linguistic experience. Now, Webster wrote widely on English, and he wrote not just these grammatical discourses, not just spellers, but as I've mentioned, the Great American Dictionary. And I want to wrap up this lecture with an extended quotation from the preface of his 1828 American Dictionary and use it as a fulcrum on which to balance my subsequent lecture as we look at the development of American language and attitudes toward it. Language, Webster wrote, is the expression of ideas. And if the people of our country cannot preserve an identity of ideas, they cannot retain an identity of language. No person in this country will be satisfied with the English definitions of the words Congress, Senate, Assembly, Court, and so on. For although these words are used in England, yet they are applied in this country to express ideas which they do not express in that country. Now, there is an obvious political position behind such remarks, reaching back to Webster's writings of the 1790s, and it's very clear that Webster is sustaining this notion of an American independence and of an American language independent from that of Britain. But I think that there's also in this sentiment and in the Dictionary of American English as a whole, his great 1828 dictionary, there is a profound debt to Samuel Johnson and to his philosophical inspirations. Johnson noted in one of his essays that difference of thought will produce difference of language. And Johnson, working from the philosopher John Locke and British empiricism, felt very strongly that there was a relationship between the source of ideas and sensation. And so when Webster says language is the expression of ideas, he's really looking back towards a Johnsonian empirical position that's keyed to the way in which the particular experience of place generates, if you like, ideational response, generates new ideas, and we need to come up with languages or words that will offer this. So there's a kind of, how can I put it, a homespun Johnsonianism to Webster. It's a world in which instruction in the arts of language takes place in the world of the schoolroom and in the world of the American landscape. And Webster makes very clear that Americans, as he says, had not only a right to adopt new words, but were obliged to modify the language to suit the novelty of circumstances, geographical and political, in which they were placed. And so now, look at the word adoption here, that we are adopting new words much as individuals are adopted into families. And that in the family of American English, For Webster, words come in, as he says, to suit the novelty of circumstances. I conclude now with perhaps the most Johnsonian moment of Webster. For you'll remember how Johnson talked about the English language itself, how trying to fix a language was as futile a gesture, as Johnson put it, as trying to distinguish a grove which the agitation of a storm cannot be accurately delineated from its picture in the water. Johnson said, to enchain a syllable and lash the wind are equally the undertakings of pride. Enchain and lash. Johnson is writing in his dictionary's preface of 1755. But enchain and lash could not but resonate in the minds of Johnson's American readers, with the notion of taxation without representation, with the notion of control and colonization, indeed, as I will call attention to in later lectures, with the notion of slavery. And so, just as it is impossible to lash the wind or to regulate a river, so it is impossible to fix a language. And Webster makes clear, as he says in the preface to the American Dictionary of 1828, it is quite impossible to stop the progress of language. It is like the course of the Mississippi, the motion of which at times is scarcely perceptible, yet even then it possesses a momentum quite irresistible. The American language is irresistible, and in my subsequent lectures, I'm going to succumb to its temptations to illustrate the ways in which it grows, develops, and offers us new ways of understanding the variety and experience of our unique culture.